Dear listener, welcome. Tonight we step away from lost islands and ancient seas and instead walk into the winding alleys of medieval Europe. This world, often called the Middle Ages, lies between the fall of Rome and the rise of the Renaissance. 1,000 years of human life, full of prayer and war, hunger and celebration, silence and song. Yet when most people imagine the Middle Ages, what comes to mind? Streets overflowing with filth, people chained by superstition, dark castles, gloomy villages, cruelty, ignorance, and fear. We often call this time the Dark Ages, as though a shadow had fallen over Europe for centuries. But is this truly how life was lived, or is this image itself a myth shaped by later generations? Let us explore this first and most enduring misconception, the belief that the Middle Ages were wholly dark. The phrase Dark Ages was not born in medieval Europe itself. It was a label applied centuries later, during the Renaissance. Thinkers like Petrarch in the 14th century looked back on the time between Rome's glory and their own revival of classical learning, and they judged it harshly. They saw themselves as bringing back the light of Greece and Rome after a long night of barbarism. The metaphor stuck. Rome had been light, the Renaissance was light, and everything in between was darkness. But dear listener, history is not so simple. While it is true that the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century brought turmoil, migrations, and the loss of centralized authority, it did not plunge Europe into complete ruin. Cities shrank, yes, and trade networks collapsed in places, yet life continued. New kingdoms rose, languages evolved, monasteries preserved manuscripts, farmers cultivated fields, artisans shaped wood and stone. The very idea of darkness comes not from the lived experience of medieval people, but from the judgment of later ages. The Renaissance needed the Middle Ages to seem darker so that its own light might shine brighter. The Enlightenment too used the term as contrast, celebrating reason by condemning what came before as superstition. And even in the modern world, the word medieval is often used as an insult, a shorthand for brutality. But if we look closer, we find light amidst the shadows. The Middle Ages gave us universities, cathedrals, poetry, music, and law codes. It preserved the philosophy of Aristotle and the medicine of Galen. It nurtured languages that would become French, Spanish, Italian, and English. It was an age of knights and monasteries, but also of merchants and craftsmen, of travelers and thinkers. Of course, we must not paint it only in rosy colors. There were famines, plagues, wars without mercy. There was injustice and poverty, yet such things are not unique to the Middle Ages. They belong to every age of human history. The myth of darkness comes not from what medieval people lacked, but from how later ages defined themselves against them. Dear listener, pause and reflect. How often do we define others by contrast, exaggerating their flaws to highlight our own virtues? Do we not sometimes look back at our younger selves with the same disdain, calling them foolish, childish, dark, so that we may see our present selves as wiser? The myth of the Dark Ages is also a mirror of human psychology. We illuminate ourselves by shadowing what came before. If you could step into the year 1000, you would not find a world of absolute darkness. You would find peasants sowing grain, monks copying texts by candlelight, traders carrying goods along river routes, children playing in village squares, poets reciting songs of heroes. You would find fears and hopes, laughter and sorrow as in every age. The image of unbroken darkness ignores the truth that even in the most troubled centuries, human beings adapt, endure, and create. Light never disappears completely. It flickers in monasteries, in village hearths, in the songs of troubadours, in the careful hands of stonemasons building cathedrals that still rise against the sky. So perhaps, dear listener, the real darkness is not in the Middle Ages themselves, but in the way we choose to remember them. When we accept myths without question, we blind ourselves. But when we look deeper, we see that history is not simple shadow and light. It is always both, interwoven, fragile, complex. As we close this first chapter, let us carry with us a gentler vision. The Middle Ages were not 1,000 years of gloom, nor a perfect golden age. They were a time of struggle and creation, of loss and endurance, a time, in short, of humanity. And that is never truly dark. Dear listener, when you picture a medieval town, what do you see? Perhaps narrow streets twisting between wooden houses, perhaps dark alleys, crowded markets, and the shadow of a cathedral rising above it all. But more often, the image that lingers in our collective imagination is this: filth, buckets of waste thrown from windows, gutters overflowing with refuse, disease spreading through stench. A world without hygiene, without care, without cleanliness. This image is vivid, even grotesque. It appears in novels, films, even in jokes. The Middle Ages as a time when people lived knee-deep in mud and sewage. But is it the truth? Or is it another myth, born from exaggeration and misunderstanding? The reality, as always, is more complex. It is true that medieval cities lacked the sanitation systems of modern towns. There were no underground sewers as we know them today, no running water in most homes. Waste was often collected in pits or carried away by night soil men. And yes, in some places chamber pots were emptied into the street, though regulations frequently forbade this practice. City laws across Europe, from London to Paris to Lubeck, reveal that authorities were deeply concerned with hygiene. They ordered streets to be swept, waste to be carted away, but enforcement was uneven, and life in crowded cities could indeed be foul. Yet to leap from these details to the idea of a people who lived without any sense of cleanliness is to misunderstand. Medieval people valued hygiene, though their means differed from ours. Bathing, for example, was more common than we often imagine. Public bathhouses existed in many towns, sometimes as social spaces where men and women bathed together, sometimes segregated. In England, in Germany, even in Scandinavia, hot baths were part of weekly routines for those who could afford them. Monasteries kept rules for bathing, not too frequent but not absent either. Soap, made from animal fats and lye, was widely used. Water itself was central. Wells, cisterns, and aqueducts provided drinking water. In larger cities like Paris, there were fountains fed by conduits where citizens drew fresh supplies. To be sure, contamination was common and disease spread easily, but it was not from ignorance alone. It was from the limits of technology. People did what they could with what they had. The myth of total filth often comes from comparing the Middle Ages not to their own reality, but to later standards. The 19th century, when modern sewer systems were being built, looked back at medieval practices with disgust, highlighting every shortcoming to emphasize its own progress. The Victorians, who suffered their own cholera outbreaks in filthy cities, projected their anxieties backward, painting the Middle Ages darker than they were. There is another layer. The stereotype of medieval dirt was also a moral metaphor. To Renaissance and Enlightenment writers, the dirtiness of the age symbolized ignorance and superstition. Cleanliness became not just a bodily state, but a cultural one. To be modern was to be clean. To be medieval was to be dirty. The streets of memory were smeared with muck to justify the brightness of progress. Dear listener, let us pause and reflect. How often do we imagine the past as more primitive than it truly was? How often do we exaggerate faults to remind ourselves of how far we think we have come? It is comforting to imagine that we live at the peak of cleanliness, wisdom, and health, but history humbles us. Even today, our cities struggle with pollution, with waste, with invisible diseases that flow through air and water. We are not so different from those who lived centuries ago. Imagine walking through a medieval town on market day. The streets are busy, filled with the cries of merchants selling fish, bread, and cloth. Yes, there is mud and the smell of animals, and perhaps the stench of refuse. But there is also the scent of herbs, roasted meat, fresh bread from ovens, candles burning in shops. There is music from minstrels, laughter from taverns, and the solemn toll of church bells. It is not only dirt, it is life, messy, crowded, imperfect, but human. And in the evenings when the market quiets, families clean their homes, wash their hands and faces, sit down to meals. Children play, women mend clothes, men share ale by the fire. Hygiene is present, though not in modern form. They brush their teeth with twigs or cloth, comb their hair with wooden combs, launder their linen in rivers. In monasteries, rules demanded washing before prayer, hands rinsed before meals, floors swept. So where does the truth lie? Somewhere between myth and reality. Medieval towns could be foul, especially in times of plague, famine, or overcrowding. But to imagine an age of people indifferent to filth is to deny their humanity. They lived as we do, with awareness of dirt, with desire for cleanliness, struggling with limits, but striving for comfort. Dear listener, as we close this chapter, let us hold this in mind. The streets of the Middle Ages were not pristine, but neither were they cesspits of indifference. They were streets of life, of trade, of laughter, of struggle. And perhaps the real filth is not in their memory, but in the myths we throw upon them. Dear listener, when you close your eyes and think of the Middle Ages, perhaps one of the most frightening images comes to mind. Witches burning at the stake, accused of sorcery, condemned by priests and consumed by fire, while terrified crowds looked on. The phrase, medieval witch hunt, has become so common that we rarely question it. But was the Middle Ages truly the age of witch burning? Or is this another myth cast backward onto a misunderstood era? The truth, as always, is both stranger and more human than the stereotype. Witch trials and mass burnings did happen in Europe, but they were not a feature of the Middle Ages at all. They belonged rather to the early modern period between the 15th and 17th centuries. It was during the Renaissance and Reformation, not the so-called Dark Ages, that Europe witnessed its most brutal witch hunts. In the early Middle Ages, belief in magic certainly existed. The Church, however, often dismissed witchcraft as illusion, a trick of the devil rather than a real power. The Canon Episcopi, a church text from around the 10th century, explicitly taught that women who believed they flew by night with the goddess Diana were deceived by demons. They were not to be burned, but to be corrected, for their visions were false. This attitude reflects a surprising skepticism. Witchcraft was seen not as a threat requiring fire, but as delusion requiring prayer. This does not mean the Middle Ages were free of fear or violence. Accusations of sorcery did occur, especially in times of famine, plague, or misfortune, when people sought causes for their suffering. Local healers or outsiders could be scapegoated, but widespread hunts with thousands of executions came later. Why then do we imagine the Middle Ages as the age of witch burning? Partly because later centuries projected their own horrors backward. In the Renaissance, as church authority fractured and anxieties about heresy grew, witchcraft was redefined. Manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, published in 1487, painted witches as members of vast conspiracies, in league with the devil, responsible for storms, disease, and crop failures. This vision demanded persecution, and across Europe tens of thousands were tried and many executed. To distance themselves, Enlightenment writers look back at the entire medieval period as an age of superstition and cruelty. The stereotype of medieval witch burnings was born, even though the most violent hunts came after the Middle Ages had ended. Dear listener, pause and reflect. How often do we assign to the past what truly belongs to later fears? How often do we paint history with broad strokes, creating shadows where none belong? The myth of the Middle Ages as an age of witch burning tells us less about medieval people and more about the anxieties of those who came after. And yet, beneath the myth lies a truth worth pondering. Whether in the Middle Ages or later, societies have always struggled with fear of the other, fear of the unexplained. When crops failed, when storms destroyed ships, when plague struck, people sought someone to blame. The accused might be a midwife, a healer with herbs, a widow who lived alone, or anyone who seemed different. Fear, when mixed with power, can easily ignite cruelty. Imagine for a moment a village in the 14th century. The harvest has failed, children go hungry, and rumors spread of a woman who knows charms and potions. Some say she cured sickness, others whisper that she caused it. She's called before the local priest, questioned, warned. Perhaps she is fined, perhaps shunned, perhaps, in rare cases, worse. But more often, the Middle Ages answered witchcraft with caution, not with fire. Contrast this with a scene 2 centuries later. A courtroom in the 16th century filled with judges holding copies of the Malleus Maleficarum. They no longer see a deluded woman, but a servant of Satan, a threat to Christendom itself. Here the fire burns hotter, here the stakes rise higher. This is not the Middle Ages, it is the Renaissance, reimagined as progress but steeped in fear. So where does this leave us? The Middle Ages did not invent the witch craze, nor did they burn witches by the thousands. That horror belonged to a later age. Yet the stereotype persists, for it fits the story we like to tell, that we are enlightened now, and they were cruel then. But history, dear listener, is not so tidy. Every age has its fears, its persecutions, its shadows. As we close this chapter, let us reflect gently. The image of witches burning in the Middle Ages is a myth, but the deeper truth it hides is timeless. Fear can make us turn on one another, and in every era we must resist the urge to cast our neighbors as enemies. The fires of persecution may belong to the past, but the sparks of fear still live among us. It is for us to choose whether to fan them or to let them fade. Dear listener, when we imagine the Middle Ages, how do we picture its children? Some say there were none at all, and not in the sense we know today. The common myth tells us that in medieval Europe, childhood barely existed. Infants were seen as small adults, dressed in miniature versions of adult clothes, sent to work as soon as they could walk, with little tenderness, little play, little sense of innocence. It is a bleak picture. Boys marching off to fight, girls discarded or drowned, children treated as burdens rather than beings to be cherished. But is this true? Did medieval people truly lack the concept of childhood, or is this another myth born of later misunderstanding? Let us begin with the origin of the idea. In the 20th century, the historian Philippe Ariès famously argued that childhood was a modern invention. He studied medieval paintings, in which children often appeared dressed like adults, and concluded that the Middle Ages did not recognize childhood as a distinct stage of life. His thesis captured the imagination, for it confirmed our suspicion of the dark, medieval world, harsh, unfeeling, indifferent to the young. Yet further research has revealed a more nuanced reality. Children were not absent from medieval hearts. They were baptized within days of birth, given names with care, mourned with deep grief when they died. Parents wrote letters worrying about their children's health. Monks recorded prayers for children's souls. Poets composed lullabies. Far from being ignored, children were woven deeply into the emotional fabric of medieval families. But their lives were fragile. Infant mortality was high. Perhaps 1 in 3 children did not live past the age of 5. This fragility shaped the way people related to children, not with indifference, but with a constant awareness of loss. Grief was real and often overwhelming. Chronicles record parents devastated by the death of a child, kings and peasants alike. If childhood seemed brief, it was not because it was unvalued, but because survival was uncertain. What of the myth that boys were sent immediately into labor or armies? The truth is gentler, though not without hardship. Children did work, helping in fields, tending animals, carrying water, but they also played. Archaeologists have uncovered medieval toys, wooden horses, whistles, dolls, miniature swords, dice. Manuscripts show children chasing hoops, playing ball, singing songs. The laughter of childhood was not absent from the Middle Ages. It echoed in village lanes and castle halls alike. Education too played a role. Boys of wealth might be sent to monasteries or cathedral schools where they learned Latin, music and scripture. Some became scribes, clerks or priests. Girls, too, could be educated, especially in convents, where they read, wrote and even composed poetry. Though opportunities were unequal, the idea that children's minds needed shaping was very much alive. And yes, some boys were sent into apprenticeship at an early age, learning trades from masters. Others were fostered in noble households, raised as squires to become knights. Life could be demanding, discipline strict, but these practices were seen as preparation, not cruelty. They reflected a society where survival required contribution, where every hand was needed. What of girls being discarded or drowned, as myths sometimes claim? Infanticide did exist in every age, but it was not uniquely medieval nor widely accepted. The church condemned it fiercely, and communities often responded with horror. If it occurred, it was out of desperation, not cultural indifference. To claim that medieval society routinely drowned unwanted daughters is to mistake scattered tragedies for the rule of life. Dear listener, pause and reflect. Childhood is always shaped by the world into which it is born. In our time, we see childhood as a space of play, learning, and protection. In the Middle Ages, survival was more precarious, labor more immediate, but this did not erase affection, care, or joy. Parents loved their children, even as they feared for them. Children laughed, played, and dreamed, even amid hardship. The myth of the absent childhood tells us more about our longing for innocence than about medieval reality. We wish to believe that childhood must always look like ours, filled with toys, schools, and protection. When we do not see that image in the past, we assume childhood was missing, but childhood has always existed. Only its forms have changed. Imagine, if you will, a medieval child at dusk, a boy chasing fireflies in a field, a girl spinning a top on a cobbled street, a group of children singing songs as they circle a maypole in spring. The centuries fall away, and we see not myth, but continuity. As we close this chapter, let us carry with us a gentler truth. Childhood in the Middle Ages was not absent nor ignored. It was tender, joyful, fragile, and fleeting, as it is in every age. For wherever there are children, there is childhood, and wherever there is childhood, there is hope. Dear listener, when many imagine women in the Middle Ages, they picture them as powerless, silent figures locked in castles, nameless peasants bent over fields, or victims of cruel customs with no voice, no freedom, no rights. The stereotype is heavy. The medieval woman as a prisoner of patriarchy, bound in chains both literal and symbolic. But is this the whole truth? Were medieval women truly voiceless, or is this another myth shaped by the way later centuries chose to remember them? To begin, it is undeniable that the Middle Ages were patriarchal. Authority in law, politics, and the church rested overwhelmingly in men's hands. Women faced restrictions in inheritance, property, and choice of marriage. Many decisions about their lives were made by fathers, husbands, or lords. The language of the time often described women as weaker, morally suspect, and in need of guidance. And yet, within this framework, women lived complex, diverse, and sometimes surprisingly empowered lives. The Middle Ages cannot be painted with a single brush. Between peasant cottages and royal courts, between convents and marketplaces, the experiences of women were varied and real. Consider the women of the peasantry, who made up the vast majority of medieval society. They worked the fields, brewed ale, baked bread, tended animals, spun wool, and raised children. Their labor was essential to survival, and though they lacked formal power, their contributions sustained villages. Marriage gave them legal standing in households, and widowhood often granted women control of property or businesses. Far from invisible, these women were the heartbeat of everyday life. In towns, women could be merchants, artisans, even members of guilds. Records from medieval cities show female brewers, cloth makers, shopkeepers, and moneylenders. Some inherited businesses from husbands, others built their own. Though often limited by law, women nonetheless participated in the economic life of their communities, and some grew wealthy in trade. In noble courts, women could wield influence through diplomacy and patronage. Queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine shaped politics across France and England. Isabella of Castile, centuries later, would change the map of Europe. Noble women often managed estates when husbands were at war, making decisions about resources, justice, and tenants. Their power was indirect yet very real. Then there were the convents. For many women, religious life offered education, autonomy, and spiritual authority unavailable elsewhere. Abbesses oversaw lands and communities, corresponded with kings, and preserved learning. Women like Hildegard of Bingen, visionary, composer, and theologian, remind us that female voices could rise powerfully in the medieval church. Though women were excluded from priesthood, they found other avenues to speak, write, and lead. The myth of women in chains also ignores the richness of medieval literature. Courtly love poetry elevated women as muses, sometimes idealized, sometimes powerful. In romances, ladies tested knights, commanding their service. In reality, the ideals were often more symbolic than lived, but they shaped cultural imagination in lasting ways. Yet we must not romanticize too far. For many women, life was indeed harsh. Marriages were arranged, often young. Childbearing was dangerous. Mortality was high. Legal rights were limited, and violence against women was frequent. The ideal of female virtue was obedience, chastity, and silence. Opportunities existed, but they were not universal. Dear listener, pause with me here. How do we hold both truths together? The restrictions and the possibilities, the chains and the freedoms. Perhaps by remembering that history is never simple. Women in the Middle Ages lived neither as complete prisoners nor as liberated equals. They lived in between, navigating the structures of their time, finding agency where they could, enduring hardship when they must, shaping families, communities, and even kingdoms in ways often forgotten. Why then does the myth of the voiceless medieval woman persist? Partly because later centuries projected it backward. The 19th century, with its own strict gender roles, looked to the Middle Ages as a mirror, imagining women entirely bound so that modern emancipation might appear brighter. Partly, too, because history often remembers kings and warriors, not mothers and merchants. The silence in chronicles is not the silence of life, but the silence of what was recorded. And perhaps the deepest reason is this. We fear forgetting half of humanity. We imagine women in chains because we know that so many of their stories were indeed constrained, erased, or silenced. The myth expresses our grief at absence, even as it distorts the truth. Imagine then a medieval evening. A mother tucks children to sleep by a fire, whispering prayers. A merchant's wife counts coins from a day's trade. A nun copies a manuscript in steady hand, her ink preserving wisdom for centuries to come. A queen writes letters that shift alliances across kingdoms. These are not images of chains, but of lives lived fully, within the limits of their world, yet shaping that world nonetheless. As we close this chapter, let us reflect with gentleness. Medieval women were not shadows, nor merely prisoners. They were workers, leaders, mothers, poets, saints, sinners, voices both heard and unheard. Their chains were real, but so were their strengths. To remember them fully is not only to dispel a myth, but to honor the human story in its fullness. Dear listener, when we imagine the Middle Ages, few figures loom larger in our imagination than the knight, a rider in gleaming armor, sword at his side, mounted on a powerful horse, a nobleman of honor, courage, and chivalry, sworn to protect the weak and serve his lady with devotion. This is the knight of legend, the hero of romances, the shining figure of tournaments and tales. But how much truth lies in this image? Were knights truly paragons of honor, or is this another myth, born from poetry more than reality? To answer, we must first understand what a knight was. In the early Middle Ages, knighthood was not about honor, but about warfare. Knights were heavy cavalry, warriors who fought on horseback with lance and sword. They were expensive to train and equip, so they came from wealthy families or served lords who could afford them. In battle, their role was to break enemy lines, to charge with force, to dominate the field. The knight's identity was born not in romance, but in violence. As time passed, the military role became wrapped in ideals. From the 11th century onward, the concept of chivalry emerged, a code of conduct blending martial skill with notions of loyalty, piety, and courtesy. Literature played a central role. The Song of Roland in France, the Arthurian romances in England, the tales of El Cid in Spain, all crafted images of knights as noble defenders, serving God, king, and lady. These stories shaped the imagination of Europe, elevating knights from warriors to icons. Yet the gap between ideal and reality was wide. Historical knights were often ruthless. Chronicles are filled with accounts of knights plundering villages, extorting peasants, waging private wars, and turning violence against the very people they were supposed to protect. So common was this behavior that the Church launched the Peace of God and Truce of God movements, urging knights to swear oaths not to harm the defenseless and to refrain from fighting on holy days. Chivalry, in part, was born as a response to knightly brutality, an attempt to tame the warrior with ideals. Dear listener, pause and reflect. How often do we, too, create ideals to soften harsh realities? How often do we tell stories not of how people are, but of how we wish them to be? The myth of the noble knight is as much aspiration as description. It reveals less about medieval battlefields and more about medieval hopes. Consider the tournament, often imagined as a pageant of honor. Knights jousted with lances, competed for prizes, displayed their skill before crowds. But tournaments were not always noble games. In their early form, they were chaotic melees, violent clashes where men were injured or killed, prisoners ransomed, wealth won or lost. Over time, rules and rituals transformed them into spectacles closer to what we imagine. But even then, danger remained. Beneath the glitter of armor was always the threat of blood. And what of the knight's devotion to his lady, the ideal of courtly love? Literature tells us of knights who pledged service to noblewomen, performing deeds of valor in their name. Yet here, too, the reality was layered. Courtly love was often symbolic, a poetic game of longing and distance, not a literal guide to relationships. Marriage in the Middle Ages was bound by politics and property, not by romance. The knight kneeling before his lady in verse was often far removed from the knight negotiating land and dowry in life. Still, the myth endured, and in enduring, it shaped behavior. Even if not all knights were chivalrous, the idea of chivalry influenced expectations. Kings and lords invoked it to inspire loyalty. The Church used it to channel violence toward crusades. Poets celebrated it, and young men aspired to it. Myths, though not always true, can become self-fulfilling when they set ideals. Imagine for a moment a knight preparing for battle. He straps on armor, heavy and creaking. He lifts his shield, grips his lance, mounts his horse. Around him, comrades do the same. Their world is not of shining legend, but of mud, sweat, and fear. Yet in his heart perhaps he carries the words of poets, the dream of honor, the hope that his deeds will be remembered not as plunder, but as valor. In this way, the myth of chivalry shapes even the man of flesh and blood. Dear listener, the knight is both myth and man, brutal warrior and idealized hero. To see only the shining armor is to forget the suffering he often caused. To see only the brutality is to miss the ideals that inspired generations. The truth lies in the tension between the two, in the distance between what knights were and what people longed for them to be. As we close this chapter, let us carry this reflection. Knights remind us that humans are rarely only what they are. We are also what we imagine ourselves to be. Between sword and song, between violence and virtue, lies the myth of knighthood. Not only a story of the Middle Ages, but a story of all human striving. When we think of medieval peasants, what picture forms in the mind? Often it is a bleak one. Bent figures in ragged clothes, bound to the soil, endlessly toiling for their lords. Powerless, voiceless, forever hungry. We imagine them as chained, not by iron, but by the weight of feudal duty. Serfs who lived like slaves, ground beneath the boots of knights and kings. But is this the truth? Or is it another myth shaped by distance and misunderstanding? It is true that the vast majority of medieval people were peasants. Perhaps 90% of the population lived not in castles or towns, but in villages scattered across the countryside. Their lives were hard. They worked the land, sowing and reaping, tending animals, paying rents or tithes. Famine and disease could strike without warning. Winter nights were cold, summers exhausting. Few peasants could read or write, and their names rarely entered chronicles. Yet to imagine them only as crushed and hopeless is to miss the complexity of their world. Medieval peasants were not slaves. They had homes, families, traditions, and rights within their communities. Even serfs, those legally bound to the land, enjoyed protections. They could not be bought and sold like objects, as in slavery. They were tied to estates, yes, but they could inherit land, marry, and pass property to children, with obligations to their lord balanced by obligations owed to them in return. Life in a medieval village was not only toil. There were festivals marking the seasons, harvest feasts, May Day dances, Christmas celebrations. There were church services, weddings, baptisms, and fairs where goods and stories were exchanged. Music, games, and laughter filled the spaces between labor. Archaeological finds show whistles, dice, and simple instruments, reminding us that joy was not absent even in the hardest lives. The stereotype of peasants as starving also requires nuance. True, famine struck at times, especially in the 14th century, when climate change and poor harvests combined with plague to devastate Europe. But in ordinary years, peasants fed themselves with bread, porridge, cheese, vegetables, and occasional meat or fish. Their diets were not luxurious, but they were not permanently on the edge of starvation. The image of constant hunger belongs more to moments of crisis than to everyday reality. What of the myth that peasants lived without freedom? Feudalism did impose obligations, rents, labor dues, military service, but peasants also had customs that protected them. They gathered in village assemblies, made decisions about common fields, and defended their rights in manorial courts. Some bought freedom, some fled to towns, where town air made free after a year and a day. Rebellions, though rare, did occur. The peasants' revolt in England in 1381, or uprisings in France and Germany. These remind us that peasants were not voiceless. When pushed beyond endurance, they spoke with force. Dear listener, let us pause and reflect. Why do we imagine medieval peasants as utterly powerless? Perhaps because history is often told by elites, kings, knights, scholars, who saw peasants as background, not as protagonists. Perhaps also because later ages needed the past to appear darker, so that modern freedoms might shine brighter by contrast. The peasant in chains is not only a medieval figure, it is a modern mirror reflecting how we define progress. And yet, when we look closely, we find resilience. Peasants shaped the land, carried traditions, and preserved cultures. They sang lullabies to children, told stories by firelight, carved wood into tools and toys, worked with rhythms older than kingdoms. Their lives were hard, but not without dignity. They were not merely victims of history, they were its foundation. Imagine for a moment a summer dawn in a medieval village. A man leads oxen into the fields, his children scattering seed. A woman bakes bread in an outdoor oven, the smell rising into the air. The bell of a small church tolls, calling to prayer. Later, when the work is done, neighbors gather for ale, laughter, and song. This is not a life of chains, but of endurance and community, a life of both struggle and meaning. Dear listener, as we close this chapter, let us hold this truth. Peasants were not faceless shadows, nor eternal prisoners. They were human beings, with hopes, fears, and joys, bound by duties but also sustained by communities. Their chains were not as absolute as myth suggests, and without them, the Middle Ages, indeed all of history, could not have stood. Dear listener, when we think of the Middle Ages and medicine, a single image often comes to mind: the plague doctor in his long cloak, gloves, and eerie mask shaped like a bird's beak. We imagine streets filled with corpses, bells tolling, and helpless doctors stuffing herbs into their masks as they wandered through cities drowning in death. The Black Death seems to define medieval medicine, and in our imagination it becomes a story of superstition, ignorance, and terror. But how true is this image? Was medieval medicine only quackery and magic, or is this another myth woven from fear and hindsight? Let us begin with the Black Death itself. In the mid-14th century, plague swept across Europe, carried by fleas on rats, striking ports and towns with staggering speed. Between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population perished. It was a catastrophe on a scale almost unimaginable, and its shadow still haunts history. The horror of the plague made an enduring impression, and later memory reduced all of medieval medicine to this moment. But the reality is more complex. The famous bird-like plague masks, for example, were not medieval at all. They appeared centuries later, in the 17th century, long after the Middle Ages. In the time of the Black Death, doctors had no such costume. They wore cloaks, yes, sometimes carried herbs or pomanders to ward off bad air, but the grotesque mask belongs to a later age. It has become a symbol retroactively attached to medieval fear. What did medieval medicine actually look like? It was built on the legacy of the ancient world, on the works of Hippocrates and Galen, carried into Europe through Arabic translations. Medicine revolved around the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant balance. Disease meant imbalance. Treatment sought to restore harmony through diet, bloodletting, or herbal remedies. To us, this may seem primitive, but within its framework, it was rational. Physicians observed symptoms, categorized diseases, prescribed regimens. They were not ignorant, but limited by the knowledge available. And they were often right in small ways. Many herbs used then, such as garlic, mint, or willow bark, have genuine medicinal properties. Monastic infirmaries grew gardens filled with healing plants. Midwives knew remedies for childbirth. Barber surgeons set bones and treated wounds. Yet medicine also mingled with faith and magic. Charms, prayers, relics, and astrological charts were used alongside herbs and diet. People believed the stars influenced health, that amulets could protect against sickness, that holy saints could intercede. In times of plague, processions, flagellants, and desperate rituals sought to appease divine wrath. It was a blend of science and spirituality, reason and ritual, all woven together in a search for meaning. Dear listener, pause and reflect. In times of crisis, do we not also turn to many sources for comfort? Even today, when medicine is advanced, people seek cures in home remedies, alternative practices, or faith. The medieval blending of magic and medicine was not mere ignorance. It was human hope, reaching for every possibility in the face of suffering. The plague itself reshaped not only medicine, but society. Doctors were powerless, priests overwhelmed, families torn apart. Some fled cities, others tended the sick and perished. Fear turned to scapegoating. Jews were accused of poisoning wells, and thousands were massacred in brutal pogroms. Here we see the darkest side of human response to disease, the search for blame when no cure can be found. Yet even in despair, seeds of progress were planted. The catastrophe forced people to question old certainties. Universities began to teach medicine with greater rigor. Dissections of human bodies, once rare, grew more common. New texts circulated, blending Arabic knowledge with European practice. Slowly, painfully, medicine advanced. The Black Death, though devastating, became a crucible that reshaped the future. Imagine for a moment a medieval infirmary. A monk tends a patient, applying a poultice of herbs. A physician listens to the pulse, studies the urine, consults an astrological chart. A midwife mixes a salve, whispering a prayer as she works. Outside, the bells toll, warning of plague. Inside, there is fear, yes, but also compassion, care, and the determination to heal. The myth of medieval medicine as nothing but superstition overlooks this reality. Knowledge was limited, but effort was real. There was ignorance, but also observation. There was fear, but also courage. The plague mask with its haunting beak is not medieval truth, but later memory, a symbol of the terror that disease still awakens in us. Dear listener, as we close this chapter, let us reflect on fragility. The Middle Ages remind us that medicine is always incomplete, always growing, always human. In their struggle, we see our own, the same fear of the unknown, the same hope for healing, the same search for meaning when the world falls ill. The plague passed, but its lessons remain, that knowledge is fragile, that compassion is as vital as cure, and that in every age we meet sickness not only with science, but with story. When you imagine the Middle Ages, what rises first in your mind? Perhaps a towering castle on a hill, its battlements gleaming in the sun, banners fluttering, a lord surveying his lands. Perhaps a grand hall filled with knights feasting, long tables laden with meat, goblets overflowing with wine, music filling the chamber. It is a vision shaped by fairy tales and films, a medieval world where everyone lived within stone walls and dined like royalty. But is this image true? Did the people of the Middle Ages really dwell in castles and live lives of endless banquets? Or is this, once again, a myth born of stories rather than reality? The truth begins with this. Castles did exist, but they were the exception, not the rule. Only a tiny fraction of the population lived in them. Kings, nobles, retainers, and servants. The vast majority of people lived in villages, in wooden houses with thatched roofs, close to the soil they tilled. To imagine the Middle Ages only through castles is to mistake the crown for the body, the few for the many. What then were castles truly like? They were not palaces of comfort, but fortresses of defense. Built first of wood, later of stone, they were designed to withstand sieges, not to pamper residents. Drafty halls, smoky hearths, narrow windows, cold chambers, these were the daily realities. Lords and ladies lived with damp walls, fleas in the rushes on the floor, and little privacy. To be sure, compared to peasants, they lived in greater security and with more food, but even their lives were far from luxurious by modern standards. The Great Hall, so often imagined as a place of endless feasting, was multifunctional. It was courtroom, dining space, and gathering place in one. Meals could be elaborate, with roasted meats, spiced dishes, and imported wine, but they were not constant banquets. Daily fare was simpler: bread, pottage, ale. The myth of perpetual feasting reflects festival days more than ordinary life. And what of the people outside the castle walls? Their lives were the true heartbeat of the Middle Ages. Peasants worked fields, tended animals, brewed ale, spun cloth. Townsfolk traded goods, crafted tools and built guilds. Pilgrims walked roads, minstrels sang songs, monks prayed in cloisters. These lives were not captured in stone castles, yet they sustained the world that castles sought to protect. Why then does the castle dominate our imagination? Perhaps because stone endures, while wood and thatch vanish. Castles remain as ruins, visible reminders of a distant age, while peasant houses have long since returned to earth. History leaves its traces unevenly, and what survives shapes memory. The myth of a castle-filled Middle Ages arises from the silence of what is lost. Dear listener, pause and reflect. How often do we mistake what endures for what was most common? How often do we remember the exceptional and forget the ordinary? In our own time, too, it is the monuments, the towers, the grand halls that survive, while the small homes, the quiet kitchens, the simple fields fade into dust. Yet it is in those small spaces that most lives are lived. Still, castles were not only stone and cold. They were symbols of power, authority, and order. To approach a castle was to see who ruled the land, to feel the presence of law and strength. For peasants, the castle was both protection and burden. A place of refuge in war, a reminder of dues in peace. To lords it was both home and fortress, a place of pride and responsibility. Castles stood as anchors in a shifting world, visible beacons of hierarchy and control. Imagine for a moment the daily rhythm within a castle. At dawn, servants light fires, fetch water, prepare bread. The lord holds court, hearing disputes among tenants. Children play in the courtyard. A scribe bends over parchment in a dim room, copying charters. Guards pace the battlements, scanning the horizon. At night, the great hall fills with talk, laughter, perhaps music, before torches sputter and darkness descends. It is not fairy tale splendor, but a rhythm of work, duty, and survival, much like life beyond the walls. The myth of the Middle Ages as an endless banquet in stone halls tells us more about our own longing for romance than about their reality. We dream of castles because they embody strength and wonder, but behind the stone was cold, behind the feast was hunger, behind the grandeur was ordinary life. As we close this chapter, let us remember the unseen. The peasants in their cottages, the townsfolk in their workshops, the monks in their cloisters. These were the true majority of medieval life. Castles may dominate the landscape of memory, but the Middle Ages were lived as much in fields and villages as in stone halls. Dear listener, the castle is both symbol and shadow. It reminds us that history is not only about the grand and enduring, but also about the fragile and forgotten. And perhaps, when we look at the ruins of stone towers today, we should also imagine the vanished cottages around them, where life was quieter, humbler, and just as real. Dear listener, our journey through the myths of the Middle Ages now comes to its final chapter. We have walked through the shadows of misconception, the so-called Dark Ages, the filthy streets, the imagined witch burnings, the childhoods denied, the women silenced, the knights idealized, the peasants chained the plague, doctors in bird-like masks, the castles of endless feasts. Each myth has been softened by truth, each shadow lit by nuance, and now we stand at the threshold where the Middle Ages fade and the Renaissance begins. What does it mean for an age to end? For centuries, historians spoke of the Middle Ages as if they ended suddenly, replaced overnight by the rebirth of classical wisdom, by humanism, by light. But the truth, as with all of history, is not so simple. Ages do not die in a single moment. They evolve, transform, blend into what comes after. The Middle Ages did not fall into silence. They flowed into the Renaissance like a river into the sea. The printing press, the voyages across oceans, the rediscovery of Greek and Roman texts. These were not ruptures but culminations. They grew from roots laid deep in medieval soil. Monks who copied manuscripts made the Renaissance possible. Gothic cathedrals prepared the way for classical domes. Scholastic debates in universities set the stage for humanist inquiry. To call the Middle Ages only darkness is to forget that the Renaissance was born of their light. Dear listener, pause and reflect. How often do we imagine progress as revolution, as sudden leaps, as clean breaks? Yet in our own lives, as in history, change is usually quieter. We become who we are not by discarding our past, but by carrying it forward, reshaping it, letting old roots grow into new branches. The myth of the end of the Middle Ages comforts us with the illusion of clear boundaries. But reality is softer, more continuous, more human. And what of the myths we have explored? Why do they endure? Perhaps because myths help us tell stories about ourselves. To imagine the Middle Ages as darker makes our present appear brighter. To imagine them as crueler makes us seem kinder. Yet when we peel back the exaggerations, we find people not so different from us. People who loved, feared, prayed, worked, laughed, mourned. They lived within limits we no longer know, but their humanity was the same. Imagine for a moment the closing of the medieval world. A monk sets aside his quill as the first printed books arrive. A knight rides no longer to tournament, but to battlefield with gunpowder. A peasant plants fields as he always has, while across the ocean new lands are sighted. The bells of cathedrals still toll, but a new music stirs in the air. The age is not gone, it has transformed. Perhaps this is the deepest lesson. History is never as simple as myths suggest. The Middle Ages were neither wholly dark nor wholly bright, neither entirely cruel nor entirely noble. They were, like every age, human, and to see them as such is to see ourselves more clearly. Dear listener, as we end this journey, let us release the myths with gentleness. The streets were not only foul, they were full of life. The women were not only silenced, they were voices in homes, convents, and courts. The peasants were not only chained, they were resilient and creative. The knights were not only noble, they were also flawed. The doctors were not only ignorant, they were also caring. The castles were not only symbols of glory, they were homes of hardship and work. And so the Middle Ages dissolved not into darkness, but into complexity, into 1,000 shades of light and shadow, into the lives of millions whose names are forgotten, but whose existence built the world we now inhabit. Now, dear listener, let the story rest. The candles are extinguished in the great hall, the village falls quiet under the stars, the bells have ceased their tolling. An age has ended, yet its echoes remain, carried in stone, in song, in memory. And you too may let go of these echoes tonight. Close your eyes, breathe gently, and let the myths of the Middle Ages fade into calm. The stories have been told, the shadows explored, the truths remembered. The night is deep, the world is quiet. Sleep well, dear listener. The Middle Ages rest, and so may you. Good night.